Unit 6, Agriculture, Chapter 9 in your textbook. There's the unit objectives, or the unit key issues for this chapter. Your content objective today is explain why people consume different foods. Your I can statements, define dietary energy consumption, nourishment, and undernourishment. 2. Explain the global distribution of undernourishment. 3. Explain the 2 reasons why food consumption varies on a world scale. 4. Explain or identify key characteristics of agribusinesses and how they increase the dietary energy consumption, and evaluate your own personal dietary energy consumption. United Nations defines food security as the access to nutritional food that meets the sufficient dietary needs for active and healthy living. About 10% of the world does not meet food security standards or minimal requirements. Dietary energy consumption. When we look at the world in general, consumption of food varies around the world. Total amount and source of nutrition varies. When we look at dietary energy consumption, we're looking at the food the individual consumes. And it varies because of 2 reasons. One of the reasons is level of development. Developed countries tend to consume more food and from different sources. The other is physical conditions, climate. Most easily grown consumed in developing countries. Developed countries ship long distances and have different climates, so they get food from different climates and thus more of a plethora or more options of diverse foods to consume, unlike less developed countries. And a third that ties into physical, can tie into physical in some texts, but it's cultural preferences, and those are food preferences that some religions tend to avoid or some cultures tend to avoid, such as we learned with pork, taboo of Muslim. The primary source of protein in developed countries comes from meat, and when we talk about developing countries, we're looking at the proteins come from grains, and oftentimes those grains are subsistent farmers that raise just enough food to feed their family, and the surplus they might use for a little bit of a cash crop. Looking at the developing countries, meat consumption is high in both China, U.S., and Brazil. China is the largest meat producer in the world, followed by the United States, then Brazil. Pork and poultry are still led by the United States. Here's a look at the calories per person. And when we look at calories per person, usually they look at kcals. And this is, again, to maintain moderate level of physical activity. On average, when we look at the kcals, we can see that clearly the United States is one of the largest consuming of kcals. The current figures, when we look at on average, the world consumes about 2,900 kcals per day. Sub-Saharan Africa consumes about 2,400, showing that a large percentage of Africans are not getting enough food to eat. And then when we look at the average American consuming, and this says above 3,500, but in your text it notes that it's 3,800, so 3,800 kcals per day, the world's highest level, more than twice the required minimum of daily activity. Looking at cereal distribution, and cereals again are consumed largely in grains or cereals rather, and they are consumed in less developed regions. And when I'm looking at the food sources, 1/3 of protein is 1/3 of protein comes from meat in developed countries, and 1/10 goes to developing countries, while more developing countries consume, in some cases, more than 50%, as we can see in this map, of cereals. So more than 50% in less developed regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southwest Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and even Eurasia, and then parts of Latin America with Mexico, Central America, then Colombia, and Peru, and Ecuador, and Venezuela. When breaking up the grains, we can see that wheat is the primary grain that is exchanged in the world. Um, it yields a high nutritional output, and it's very light to transport. So it's the most widely traded grain in the world. And grain is found in more humid continental climates. So Europe, North America, Central and Southwest Asia. Rice, on the other hand, is found in East and Southeast Asia. However, rice production is predominantly in Southeast Asia. And then when we look at maize, maize is the leading crop of producer of maize is the United States. All right, again, when we talk about maize in North America, they nearly produce 90% of all grain production. And we can see the distribution of wheat and how it's seen as a grain that is widely circulated and seen as a high commodity grain in the world market. And this shows us the distribution. Again, as I already mentioned, the difference between developed and developing country is that protein of meat, and so we can see that in core countries. Right. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right. Meat consumption in the United States, the ever-increasing number of animals on farms. We have the increasing number of meat consumption in semi-periphery countries like China. We have animal slaughtering and processing, which is mixed crop and livestock farming, which is dominated by agribusinesses. So very large farms, few farmers. Most agribusinesses will have small farmers that farm for them, and they'll control everything from seed distribution to marketing to fertilizers to processing to sales. When we look at the development of the poultry industry, chicken is the least expensive to process, develop and process. Fast food restaurants have created an homogeneous landscape, which has destroyed the fertility of some soil and caused soil erosion and pollution, which we'll talk about later. Looking at undernourishment, going back to Tom Malthus's theory, we learned in Unit 2 in population. Remember, Thomas Malthus said that the food would grow arithmetically, and the food would grow arithmetically, and the population would grow geometrically. So, in other words, the food would grow linearly, and the population would explode. When we look at this, we can see that this is a reality according to the United Nations for 830 million people that are undernourished. 99% are in developing countries. When we see the change in the last decades, not a lot has changed simply because of the rapid population growth. Food production has increased, but has not kept up with the population. This is seen in parts of like the Horn of Africa, where farmers have overplanted and overgrazed, and their population is growing fast. And last year, they had over 11 million. The famine has killed over 11 million people in the Horn of Africa. We also see in sub-Saharan Africa that faces the highest rates of undernourishment, when we see their total kcals are 2,400, which is undernourishment. And the food production just has not changed, because we know that in sub-Saharan Africa there's a population explosion. In South Asia would be another region of the world where there's undernourishment. When we look at the distribution of undernourishment, about a fourth is in sub-Saharan Africa and about a fifth is in South Asia. Then the largest numbers are in India and China, because of the two most populous countries. And China has seen the largest decrease in undernourishment with their rapid economic development. All right, and this shows the distribution in the pie chart of undernourishment. So we can see India and China are the two largest countries. China's shown the fastest decline. We can see the region that has the most is sub-Saharan Africa. And then we can see other regions outside of sub-Saharan Africa, like Iraq and Southwest Asia, or the Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, Southeast Asia. All right, so again, it shows the concentration of undernourishment in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, it follows the development of countries. The low-developed countries will see the highest cases of undernourishment. A greater percentage of income is spent on food in developing countries. So when we look at undernourishment and we think about food prices in the 21st century, people on average have spent less than 20% of their income on food in developed countries, whereas in developing countries like sub-Saharan Africa, they spend over 40%, which are record high levels. The reason for the low food prices in the in developed regions is because of competition within supermarkets that help keeps the price low, whereas that competition isn't found in developing regions because they're mostly subsistence farmers, where now they have to provide food for their family, but now with the large interregional migration of people moving from primary jobs in rural areas to secondary jobs in urban areas, they got to feed them because they don't have farms. So they face a dilemma with trying to feed both their family and the urban residents. All right, and again, here's a line chart that shows the food production has increased substantially, but hasn't kept up with the population in sub-Saharan Africa. All right, and this shows the increase of food prices, global food prices. And when we look at the food prices too, the prices are brought down, as I already mentioned, by fierce competition of supermarkets in developed regions. But food prices have reached a record high. Prices for agricultural land has gone up because of urban sprawl, which we see depletion of prime agricultural land. The price, for instance, for the price of a farm in Iowa increased from $2,500 per capita in 2000 to $10,000 in 2020. All right, again, we see supermarket competition driving prices down. All right, as mentioned, the dietary energy consumption, according to the UN, you should consume about 1,800 kcals. Worldwide, consumption is 50% more than the daily recommendation. U.S. has the highest, which I already mentioned. All right, quickly review. All right, again, we look at obesity, which ties into epidemiological stages 3 and 4, so chronic diseases caused by human behavior. Obesity leads to many chronic diseases such as diabetes or heart or cardiovascular disease. Make sure you can answer the questions at the end. That will conclude today's notes.